Who is Dorothy Scott?
What happened to her?
Who is Dorothy Scott?
What happened to her?
What happened to her? Dorothy Scott. Dorothy Scott.
What happened to her?
Who is Dorothy Scott?
Today we're going to be talking about the unsolved murder of Dorothy Jane Scott. Ever since the early 1980s, Scott, who was a single mother of a 4-year-old son named Sean, had been receiving threatening calls at her aunt's home in Stanton, California, where her and her son lived. The calls to Scott would often differ from the caller professing his love to her or threatening her. There was one time he told her to go outside because he left her a gift in her car, and there was a single rose placed on her windshield in her car. No matter what the caller said, it was evident to Scott that he had been watching her. These calls were very unsettling, and Scott and her family were very concerned. But unfortunately, in 1980, there weren't many laws against stalking, so there wasn't much that Scott or her family could do. Scott had mentioned to her family members that she could recognize the voice on the phone, but she couldn't put a face to it. All she knew was that the voice sounded familiar, but she didn't know who it was coming from. On the night of May 28th, 1980, Scott had dropped her son off at her parents' house in Anaheim to attend a staff meeting at her workplace. While she was at the meeting, she noticed that one of her coworkers looked ill and suggested to him that they go to the ER. He took her up on this suggestion, and her and another coworker went with him to the hospital. On the way to the hospital, Scott wanted to stop by her parents' house to check on her son, and while she was at her parents' house, she switched her black scarf that she was wearing for a red scarf. At the hospital, it was determined that her coworker was bitten by a black widow spider. So while he was being treated for it, she and the other coworker stayed by his side throughout the whole night. The only time that they parted ways was when the man that was bitten by the black widow spider and Scott's coworker went to get the prescription filled, and Scott went to go get the car. After Scott's two coworker friends had gotten his prescription filled, they were waiting outside for Scott to pull around with the car. And after a few minutes went by and there was no sighting of Scott, they started to get a little startled. And then they saw Scott's car speeding away with the headlights blinding them so that no one could see who was at the wheel. And once the car had turned the corner, the headlights were turned off. Initially, the two coworkers assumed that something might have happened to Scott's son, and she was rushing to get to her parents' house to check on him. But after a few hours, they hadn't heard from her, so they reported her missing. Early the next morning, Scott's car was found set ablaze about 10 miles away from the hospital, and no one was found inside of it. About a week later, Scott's mother received the first call from the suspect, and he said, "Are you related to Dorothy Scott?" "Yes." "I've got her." This was the first call that her parents would receive, but it was nowhere near the last. Shortly after these calls had started, Scott's father wanted to get media attention, so he went to the Santa Ana Register asking them to run a story about his missing daughter. This story was ran June 12th, 1980, and it was the same day that the paper's editor received a phone call from someone claiming to be Dorothy Scott's killer. He stated, "She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." These chilling phone calls stopped in April of 1984, almost 4 years after the death of Scott, but they resumed after Scott's remains were found in August. And the killer's taunting calls have never been solved, and Scott's murder remains unsolved to this day.